Recession on 1949. The chairman of Federal Reserve at that time was Thomas B. McCabe. There was three reasons started the recession. The recession began shortly after President Truman's Fair Deal economic reforms. The recession also followed a period of monetary tightening by the Federal Reserve. The tremendous wartime government purchases of goods and services caused the unemployment rate to fall below 2% in 1943, 1944, and 1945. The decisions The Federal Reserve had continued to conduct open market operations to support bond price and the interest rates rather than to fight inflation and recession and stabilize the business cycle. Federal Reserve Chairman Thomas B. McCabe announced that the Federal Reserve would conduct monetary policy with a primary regard to business conditions, a step that McCabe later said marked the removal of the straitjacket in which monetary policy had been operating. Previously, Fed policies during World War II and the post-war years had been conducting support of long-term debt prices to help the government finance spending. Effects. The government's response was minimal, as it was much more worried about inflation than unemployment at the time. However, the Korean War helped to recover the economy and employment. Criticisms due to the lack of interpretations on the unemployment and the decline of GDP. Criticisms were unhappy about the performance of Federal Reserve evaluation. In my opinion, the recession on 1949 was natural. The country just finished the battle. All the soldiers need jobs and the government needs to rebuild. The situation was not that bad compared to other countries. While the country started to recover, the Korean War began, so that the recession ended suddenly. That's it.
I'm talking about recession in 1953. William McChesney Martin Jr. is the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the recession. The recession from 1953 to 1954 occurred because of a combination of events during the earliest parts of the 1950s. In 1951, there was a post-Korea War inflationary period, and later in the year more funds were transferred into national security. Further, inflation was expected into 1952, and the Federal Reserve set in motion restrictive monetary policies, and there are several monetary policy decisions. During this time, the Treasury also lent the majority of the national debts and pursued flexible interest rate policies. Alongside these policies, the Treasury also began to do debt refunding, which only increased interest rates further, and subsequently issued a low percentage bond. The Federal Reserve recognized the increasing interest rates and decided to allow more reserves to be available. The effect is it worked, but interest rates plummeted, sending the U.S. into a demand-driving recession of output and employment. GDP declined because of government spending and investment. The recession of 1953 was demand-driving because the dramatic changes of interest rates earlier in the year led to an increase in pessimism towards the economy, which led to a decrease in aggregate demand. Before the Federal Reserve stepped in to increase availability of reserves, the increase in interest rates continued to decrease aggregate demand. And finally, the actions of the Federal Reserve led to an increase in consumer expectation of an inevitable recession, which led to an even further drop in aggregate demand and an increase in saving. Thus, the recession of 1953 began on the demand side. The sharp three-quarter decline with a clear chart followed by a sharp recovery means that the 1953 recession is an example of a V-shaped recession. From my opinion, I don't think it is a good decision for recession because the decision that Federal Reserve supposed is just let the economy decrease and it didn't lead them to a good way or positive.
Recession of 1958. Chairman of the Federal Reserve, William Martin, Chairman of the United States Federal Reserve Bank from 1951 to 1970. Cause odd sales fell 31% of 1957, making 1958 the worst auto year since World War II. 2. Housing construction slowed to higher interest rate in 1955 and 1956. Third, gradual decrease in incoming business of capital goods industry. 4. The virus epidemic of the 1957 to 1958, the Coast Asia flu. Monetary policy. 1. In an effort to overcome declining auto sales, one of the hardest hit sectors of the slump, the Bayer DeSoto dealership of the Louis put its salesman on duty for 64 hours straight as part of a sale-a-thon that raising sales 33%. By 1957, new house construction had fallen to about 1.2 million units. 3. Federal Reserve economics believe that the administration had contributed to the recession by cutting back on Department of the Defense pressure in 1957. Construction projects already on the way were accelerated, and those already funded were planning and began immediately. In order to encourage home building, the administration ending restriction on no down payment mortgage laws. In June 1958, the Congress enacted the legislation of the authorized federal assistance to the states so that they could last the period of unemployment benefit. The Federal Reserve made the move once aware of the severity of the situation, lowering the discount rate to 1.75% until the condition began to improve. Monetary policy also played a role in dealing with the recession. By the 1957 to 1959, it was index of the indirect production was 152. Total employment has increased by about 1 million from the recession low, where unemployment have been reduced by 1 million. Income and the expenditure of the individual were at the new high level.
The 1973 to 1975 recession. The chairman is Arthur Frank Barnes. The recession of 1973 to 75 in the U.S. came about because the rocketing gas prices caused by OPEC's raising oil prices as well as embargoing oil exports to the U.S. Other major factors included heavy government spending on the Vietnam War and the Wall Street stock crash in 1973 to 74. To promote economic growth, a country's central bank can increase the money supply to increase demand. The prices without raising concerns about inflation. As the dollar depreciated, people replaced the dollar with the gold. In late 1973, Nixon completely decoupled the dollar from gold. The market quickly pushed the price of precious metals to $120 per ounce. Inflation has reached double digits. Congress lost control of the money supply, and the amount of money supply determines the value of um, purchasing power of any unit of the money supply. Therefore, the argument is the Congress is no longer able to fulfill its constitutional responsibility to the public to regulate our monetary value. The evaluation, the recession has had a very negative impact on private investment. A large number of businesses has closed down. Workers have lost their jobs, and economics growth has stalled. During the entire period of the stagflation, the U.S. stock market has under, undergone 6 rounds of adjustment. The stock market bears out before the recession, and the stock market stabilizes before the economy stabilizes. At the same time, the Western economies are suffering from stagflation. The expansion of U.S. credit has instead contributed to the economic development of less developed countries and the expansion of world trade.
I'm going to talk about the recession in 1980. The chairman of the Federal Reserve during the recession was Paul Volcker. As the federal funds rate increased, credit became more difficult to obtain for car and home loans. And also, the unemployment rate increased a lot, especially in goods producing industries. And this is how the recession started. About the monetary policy, President Jimmy Carter created his own plan for credit controls and budget cuts to beat inflation. And finally, the federal funds rate was lowered in April. Some effects of the monetary policy, the payrolls turned to positive. However, the unemployment rate increased a lot, from a low of 4.8% to a record high of 24.7%, and only fell a little bit at the end of the year to 17.4%. And it is the same to the construction unemployment rate. Some criticisms about the Federal Reserve's decisions, as people think the housing and auto sales has a poor performance in the final months of 1980, and also there was a second wave of rising interest rates and stagnant unemployment rate. People doubt that the economy was in recovery and instead was experiencing a temporary respite. As a result, I think they did a bad job in the recession because of the high unemployment rate and the rising of interest rate.
The number of new coronavirus cases continue to increase and may continue to increase in the next few weeks. The result is a different global economy, with economically active consumers staying at home and business closing. Unemployment has risen sharply. Key industries are facing massive damage and possible bankruptcy. And the central bank has lowered interest rates and injected liquidity on an unprecedented scale. Asset and commodity prices have fallen sharply, increases risk spread may lead to credit market trouble. Investors first evaded the security of bonds and then turned to the security of cash. Moreover, due to the limited impact of monetary policy, governments in Europe and North America are planning or considering significant increasing fiscal spending.